Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, NASA Erasing the Past to Create Future Funding. George Orwell famously wrote in his prophetic novel 1984, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." 10 years ago, Greenland was melting, and the National Science Foundation said that it mimicked a melting event from the 1920s to the 1940s. So it must have been very warm in that part of the Arctic from the 1920s to the 1940s, just like it was in 2007. And the historical record bears this out. In 1923, it was widely reported that the North Pole was melting and many glaciers were vanishing. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sailed the seas around Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climate conditions, with hitherto unheard of high temperatures on that part of the Earth's surface. And in 1939, the world's leading Arctic expert reported that Greenland's glaciers were melting. "All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting," declared Professor Hans Almond, Swedish geologist. It may, without exaggeration, be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. And in 1940, it was reported that Arctic sea ice was also melting very rapidly. The ice of the Arctic Ocean is melting so rapidly that more than one-third of it has disappeared in 50 years. In 1893, Nansen recorded a maximum ice thickness of 365 centimeters. In similar positions, the captain of the set-off found the greatest thickness was 218 centimeters. So the ice thickness in the Arctic declined tremendously from 1893 to 1940, from 365 centimeters down to 218 centimeters, which is about what it is now. There are thousands and thousands of articles out there similar to these, so we know that the Arctic was very warm from the 1920s to the 1940s. Thermometers from that region also show this warmth from the 1940s. The gold line here shows the actual measured temperatures, and the blue line shows what NASA does after they adjust the temperatures. The blue line here shows how NASA has massively cooled the past at Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. Temperatures around 1940 are cooled more than 2 degrees centigrade, and you can see how NASA, with their adjustments, has completely removed the warmth from 1920 through 1940s. So NASA has completely removed the prior warmth from Reykjavik and created a fake warming trend which doesn't actually exist. And it wasn't just Reykjavik where they did this. They did exactly the same erasing the past at all of the stations around Iceland. I'm going to flip through them here and you can see for yourself. And not only did NASA erase the warmth around 1940, but they also erased the cooling which occurred after 1940. It no longer exists in their temperature record. So by altering the data, NASA has essentially erased two very inconvenient time periods for them: the 1940s warmth and the global cooling which occurred from the 1940s through the 1970s. But the 1940s warmth and subsequent cooling was very real. In fact, in 1961, it was reported by the New York Times that there was unanimous agreement among scientists that the Earth had been getting colder. Unanimous is even more than the 97% consensus they claim now for global warming. And in 1971, NASA's top climatologist predicted a new ice age by around the year 2020. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is the government's climate lab in Boulder, Colorado, reported a lot of warming before 1940 and a lot of cooling after that. In fact, they showed that 1970 was actually cooler than 1870. And not only did they report that Earth was cooling, but they blamed every form of bad weather on global cooling. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people consider these weather conditions to be abnormal and temporary, but instead, climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with unusually mild weather, i.e., warm weather, and that global cooling was producing all of these bad weather events, the exact same type of weather which they now blame on global warming. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. The average temperature of the world as a whole has dropped by one-third to one-half a degree centigrade in the last 30 years. The decline of prevailing temperatures since about 1945 appears to be the longest continued downward trend since temperature records began, says Professor Hubert H. Lamb of the University of East Anglia in Great Britain. He was Britain's leading climate expert. Global cooling may be related to the devastating African drought now in its sixth year. Some scientists believe that expansion of the cold polar air caps pushed the monsoon rain belt southward. So they blamed devastating 1970s droughts on the polar vortex, which was caused by global cooling. Now they blame the exact same thing on global warming. All of this history was very inconvenient for NASA, so they did what they typically do. They simply erased it. NASA got rid of the 1940 spike and subsequent cooling, which was reported by NCAR in 1974, and replaced it with a fake continuous warming trend from 1880 to the present. NASA's behavior is straight out of Orwell's 1984. They're behaving as the Ministry of Truth. And 1 year ago this week, NASA sent this letter to Australian Senator Malcolm Roberts, denying that they were responsible for this. Senator Roberts sent a polite letter to NASA's climate chief, Gavin Schmidt, asking him to explain the temperature adjustments in Iceland. Gavin Schmidt responded by saying it wasn't his fault. He said he just gets the data from NOAA. So he was passing the buck on to NOAA. Schmidt didn't deny that the NASA data contained these horrific, unsupportable adjustments. He just said it was somebody else's fault. People all over the world see these NASA temperature graphs and think they actually mean something. They believe that something serious is happening with our climate, when in fact it's nothing but fake data. An entire religion has been built up around NASA's fake temperature graphs, which includes the Pope, who now says that anyone who questions the junk science coming out of NASA and NOAA has a perverse attitude. Global warming is religion based on fake altered data, straight out of Orwell's Ministry of Truth. Orwell intended for his novel 1984 to be a warning, not an instruction manual as NASA has adopted. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.